Tell us about how words create reality, unless you already have.
I have not. To tell you how words create reality, I will tell you a little story. In 2014, a man went to have a tumor removed from his mind, from his brain. But he noticed something interesting. The tumor was taken out, and yet after he finished the surgery, he realized that something in his mind shifted. He was no longer able to see imagery in his mind's eye. How many people here think using imagery? You don't? No, you do. Okay. All of you. Remember we were talking before about standard deviation? Most people think in imagery. How many people here can hear an inner dialogue in their mind? A lot of people can hear an inner dialogue, just don't realize that they have an inner dialogue. That is auditory thinking. Okay, Temple Grandin, very famous autistic, wrote many books about the mind. She only thinks in images. She cannot think auditorily. My wife is like that. In 2014, when this person lost the ability to see in his mind's eye, he went to the doctors and said, what happened? And they said, okay, well, did you lose any functionality? We never heard of a person who doesn't see in his mind's eye. Why? Because the normal, it's called mentally typical people, all see some kind of form of imagery, some vivid, some not. But some form of imagery, some think in pictures, some use pictures to think. Two different things. But most of us can see some kind of imagery. The man says, no, I didn't lose any functionality. I can still park my car, I can still remember everything. The doctor was like, this is impossible. What do you mean? So they gave it a name, aphantasia. Aphantasia. A means not. Fantasia means fantasy, fantasizing. Now, why do I give this as an example for words create reality? I'm an aphantasiac. I'm completely blind in my mind's eye. I never had a tumor removed. I was like that since the day I was born. My father is like that too. And I know many people who are. This beautiful woman is like that as well. This woman though, Stephanie, she thinks she dreams sometimes in imagery, if I remember correctly, you're telling me. I don't. I dream, I fantasize, I visualize, I imagine, but not with imagery. Now, how do I think if not in imagery? Well, I think auditorily and also with sensation, with vibrations. I dream in vibrations. I can dream about being in my parents' house, and I can feel it's my parents' house, and somebody walks in and I know who that, but there's zero imagery. Or maybe I know that someone in the dream had a green dress, but I didn't see a green dress in my mind's eye. Now, I can't explain to you without saying I imagine, I fantasize, I visualize, because words create consciousness. It is only the words that create our conscious perception. If I'll make up a new word, okay, for the way I think, then suddenly we will have a conscious perception of the fact that someone does not think with mental imagery. So they created a word called aphantasia. Okay? Now what's the problem with that word? It's not accurate. I can fantasize. Besides, who wants to be a fantastic? It's not a good word. It describes what I'm not what I am. And we should never tell people what they're not. We should always tell them what they are if we know what they are. And it's funny that most of the people who name these things are usually the people who never been in that state of consciousness. Like Mr. Hans Asperger's, who studies people with Asperger's, which now we know are essentially marginally autistic, people who are heavily polarized to the masculine mind, right? Very analytical, not very intuitive in that way. That's why the connection with people. And so these people create the language in order to be able to talk about it. But it's problematic, and I'll give you an example. So I listened to this podcast about the mind, because that's what I do. And I hear a doctor, speaking about aphantasia. 4 years later, it's 2018. It's only in 2014 we realized, as a collective, that some people don't see in their mind's eye. Of course, I knew it because I thought everybody thinks like this until 2012 when I discovered the dance sees in imagery. 4 years, and now there is not one university that respects itself when it comes to consciousness research that doesn't do research with aphantasia. It became the thing. And so a doctor is on a podcast and he's saying, yeah, one of the things we're researching is people with aphantasia potentially would not know the consequences of pushing somebody in front of a moving train because they cannot imagine. How many people hear that podcast? How many people have an idea planted in their head? The next time somebody does something like that and happens to be an aphantasiac, suddenly all aphantasiacs are cold-blooded killers. Now, I know I'm taking it in extreme, but this is how consciousness is created. Consciousness is created with words. Theology tells us this. First was the word. What is language? Language is the collective consciousness of its people. We cannot communicate without labels. You're born. The first thing that happens when you're born, hey, it's a boy. You got the first label. Some people still fight it, right? Or you're a girl or whatever. Oh, you're also an American or an Israeli, and you're also a firstborn, or you're also this, or also that, and you like this. By the time you have your own conscious perception, you have a pile of labels that is from here till Tuesday. And this is what creates your consciousness. It is only later, when you're becoming 12, 13, you're starting to realize that this idea of life is not really real. That, oh, I thought life was grand, and it's not really, and this and that. It starts to dissolve, right? And it takes years, and life is a continuous destruction, okay, elimination of our existing conscious perception and building a new one. This is what the consciousness movement is all about. It's about breaking the ideas that we have. What are these ideas? They're labels. Every idea that you have about life is an idea that is rooted in a particular label of some sort. We cannot communicate, we cannot exchange energy between two conscious beings without some kind of language. It could be physical. If you look at my body and I do something, you see something. That's language too. That's a feminine language. Body is always feminine, Mother Earth. This is the masculine language, speech. But you have to have labels. Without labels, there is, So some labels are objective and some labels are subjective. And the problem with language, and metaphysics tells us that the source of all human conflict is this confusion between objective and subjective labels. For example, if you say the word table, this is a table, and arguably enough, I can do this, and now I'm a table, right? Now, most people will imagine in their mind's eye, either with imagery or with not, some kind of a table. But if I say fairness, anybody had something come to mind? It's an abstract term. You can't think about fairness as a conceptual object. It's a subjective term. The problem starts that when we think that some words are objective, where in fact they're subjective. And the reality is, language is subjective. And so another difference between Hebrew and English. English is schizophrenic language, right? From all, every word can mean so many things, it all depends on context. Hebrew is not like that. Because every word is rooted in 3 letters, there's 22 letters in the Hebrew language, which means you have 231 combinations of 2 letters, which are called in Hebrew gates. So for example, my name is a result of 3 different gates. Erez, Aleph Zayin, Aleph Resh, and Resh and Zayin. 3 gates are creating my name. Aleph Resh, can also create the word Avir, which means air. So each gate leads you, it's like a branch of a tree. Like the root is the 22, and it just goes on and it mixes. but you can take every word and go back to the root, and you know exactly what the root means. Because every letter has a very specific meaning. It's an objective language. And so that's the idea. Words create consciousness. And so we have to be careful what we say. What do they say in, is it Buddhism? You know, never say something unless. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? And I heard somebody say, does it add to silence? Right? And so that's how words create consciousness. Does this make sense at all? I want to say one more thing about consciousness. Sexuality is a great example. We have no language to talk about sexuality. We have no language to talk about the mind. Here I am, I have a book proposal. In order to bring this knowledge into existence, I had to create a whole language. How can I speak of them if we all think that, that we think with one mind? How can I speak about consciousness if we in fact think with two minds? Suddenly I have to create a term that's called polarization of consciousness. Consciousness is three-dimensional, so it has a direction, it has a potentiation. So I'm creating new words, and with these words, as I'm teaching people, as I'm writing about it, I'm creating a new consciousness, a new collective consciousness around the idea of the mind. And so we need to develop language around the mind. We need to develop language around sexuality. We need to develop language around politics, and so that we can understand each other instead of, right? And that's the idea.